I was a very gay child.
Okay.
I was super femme, super into musicals, very difficult to hide. I had crushes on boys, and I never thought to even hide those kind of things. So I was also kind of an oddball in my own environment.
That was journalist and nightclub co-owner Marke Bieschke. I'm Jeff. Welcome to Storied San Francisco, a weekly podcast where San Franciscans from all walks of life share their stories, and you get to know your neighbors. In this podcast, Mark takes us back to Michigan in the 70s and 80s. He was an outspoken and, in his words, very gay kid. He eventually got into punk and goth music, and he and his friends put on raves in Detroit. All of this happened before a very serendipitous train trip to San Francisco that changed his life. This episode is going to sound a little different from what you're used to. It was the first of what will be several podcasts recorded using Zoom. Just something we'll have to get used to for a while. Here's Mark.
I am an adopted child. I'm from the Lebanese Catholic community of Detroit, but I was adopted by fabulous French, Canadian, German, Polish parents. And I was raised in Roseville, which is a little bit outside, right on the outskirts of Detroit. And also, my mother is from a very expensive farm family in southern Ontario. So I would spend half my year. So I would spend half my year on the farm in southern Ontario with zillions of relatives, because everybody is related there in farm country down there. And then I'd come back and I'd spend the rest of the year in kind of a semi-urban environment.
Right.
By Detroit.
And of course, when you're in Canada, people are nicer immediately, right? And then you come back and you're like, everyone's pissed off. And,
Oh yeah, no, everyone was really nice. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we were all picking cucumbers out in the field, so we were all friends and relatable.
What an image.
It was definitely. My cousin. I would stay mostly with my aunt and uncle when I would be in Canada with my family. We have a farmhouse out there, and they have 12 kids, so it was a huge family to come from.
Okay.
I myself have just one sister, but I really was kind of de facto brothers and sisters with about 12 of my relatives. So
y'all were
big family. Yeah.
Y'all were really close.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Are you older than your sister, or is...
I am. I'm the oldest one. We're both adopted. She is the opposite of me. She's very blonde and fair-haired, and blue-eyed, and whereas I have kind of the typical features of a Lebanese person,
right?
right down to the unfortunate sprouts of facial hair where I don't need them.
Hey, we're mammals, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Some of us more mammalian.
Yeah. So you mentioned kind of splitting a lot of your childhood time between Ontario and, I think especially with that contrast, you'd have impressions of like what was Detroit like, especially with that contrast.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, especially in the 70s, Detroit was kind of in a total flux. My parents were part of the white flight movement out of Detroit to the suburbs. That happened in the 60s. Obviously redlining made it impossible for people of color and Black people to move out of Detroit, which is why my Lebanese community that I came from still is a huge part of Detroit as well.
Right.
And so, after the riots in 67, 68, Detroit became a very changed town. It was already changing.
Right.
So when I was growing up, it was just starting to get the reputation that it garnered eventually internationally as a very tough, downtrodden, poverty-stricken place. Much of which was very true. A lot of which existed in contrast with the rich white suburbs of all the people who had taken their money and left.
Right.
So yeah,
Did
it
you
was a very
see that?
segregated time.
Were you aware of that as a kid?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my grandmother lived downtown still, not downtown, but she lived on the east side. We're East Side Detroiters, and she had a house kind of towards the outskirts of Detroit, around 7 Mile Road, 6 7 Mile Road, a street called Craft, and that was right before you would hit one of the richest suburbs in the country of Grosse Pointe.
Oh,
And that line, yeah, and that line became this surreal, dystopian future where you would go from, it was kind of declining in my grandmother's time, but you would go from small houses that were beginning to be burnt out, buildings that were abandoned, very little population, burnt out whole sections of blocks, to suddenly these rich stained glass mansions on the water that had their own police force. It was very RoboCop. If you watch the movie RoboCop, you can see where that kind of dystopian future comes from. And I took my husband back there to see a few years ago, and we were driving, and he was just amazed, and it brought back home to me how this was just something I had lived with for so long, where you just the crossing the line, there. Yeah.
Was it something like your family was aware of and talked about? Was it an open, not a secret, kind of like there's this thing in this place we live?
I mean, my family is very realist, and they are people who definitely talk about things. But I feel like the kind of changes that were happening were so big that they, from a previous generation, didn't have a language to speak about it. So I know that my generation, I had so many friends from Detroit and so many friends from outside Detroit. I had Black friends. I had friends. We have a huge Asian population in Detroit and Mexican population that doesn't get talked about. And I was lucky enough to have friends from all of those places, which, was so different from the hegemony of my parents, the homogeneousness of my parents' generation. But we definitely, I was a super outspoken liberal radical leftist from the time I was a kid, and so even if I was very argumentative about what was going on, and so my poor parents had to kind of, no matter what stance they took, it wouldn't have been radical enough for me.
Where do you think you got that from?
I don't really know. It's one of the things I actually admire about myself, is that I don't know where I got a lot of it from. I think a lot of it was probably inculcated from Sesame Street, kind of we are one togetherness. Kind of what now people would call maybe a little bit of neoliberalism, but it's like diversity is the way, and I looked around my community and I didn't see a lot of diversity, and that kind of woke me up to what the heck is going on here a bit. I think another thing that woke me up was when I was 8. My dad got a position. He was a financial advisor. He got a position in London. And so we all moved over to the UK for a couple of years. And I went to an American school there called American Community School in Hillingdon. And it was full of, at that time, which was 1978, 79, it was full of refugees from other countries. So we had a lot of Iranian refugees. There were people coming in from Africa. They would all go to the American school because they weren't quite in the same system as the British school, the UK school. So I met just people from all over the world, and that really woke me up to what was happening in the world.
And you said you were 8, or how old were you?
Yeah, 8. I was. Let me think. I was 9 when we moved. Yeah, 9.
That'll do it, right? I mean, I as I was asking that question, I realized, at least for myself and for some people, you're like, well, how did you come about your worldview or whatever it is, like, by living? By just like getting out of if you grew up in the suburbs, like getting out of the suburbs, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah, getting to see the world. And also I was a very gay child. I was super femme, super into musicals, very very difficult to hide. I had crushes on boys, and I never thought to even hide those kind of things. So I was also kind of an oddball in my own environment. Not to
Okay.
mention that here I was, this like Arab kid with a big nose and darker features, which are actually dark when I can go out in the sun. But I was kind of already like a little bit of an outsider. My community was always very loving, Catholic. They were Roman Catholic. My neighborhood was very Italian. Everyone was always very loving and accepting. But it was hard not to notice how different I was from them a lot of the time.
Right. And your family was cool. Like, was there a coming out ever? I don't want to jump ahead, but like.
Right. Yeah. No, I had to, when I was 19, I had to officially declare my coming out just because we needed a point where I came out. But before then, it basically had been happening, and my parents hadn't really bought, like I had brought dates home. We hadn't had deep conversations about it. I think a lot of it was during the height of AIDS. So my parents were a little afraid to delve into, but yeah, I was gay as can be from the very beginning.
Okay. I mean, in a way, I would think that's easier for you, right? It's you never. Yeah. Did you ever have to struggle with that, with your homosexuality?
I mean, I think it kind of comes with being a Roman Catholic, that you have to struggle with, waking up in the morning,
being alive. Yeah.
How dare you?
Yes. Oh, I fucked up already.
But definitely, anything sexual or anything like that, is very guilt-ridden, etc. And so, I mean, there were some moments when it was like, there were moments when I just was like, I'm going to try to pray to be normal. Even though I know how silly that is, but you're alone, you're in the suburbs, there's no internet, there's none of that kind of thing. Luckily, I had other gay friends that I could meet up with who are from a very young age. But it's like, you never saw a gay person. I mean, we had Paul Lynde on Hollywood Square.
Center Square.
Liberace, but who knew?
Yeah. What kind of, I guess, so I did jump ahead a little bit, but going back to kind of your like teenage years, your high school, middle school, high school, formative years, what kind of things were you and maybe your friends doing? Kind of things.
Right. Well, I mean, so I went to, when we came back from the UK, I was enrolled in Catholic schools, first to finish middle school at a small place called St. Thecla. We moved to kind of a little suburb called Mount Clemens. And I managed to make some friends there, but that was when I was really, my difference was thrown into high relief. That was when people started threatening to beat me up. And actually did beat me up on occasions. It was a very, and you didn't have anyone to turn to because you were, the head nun was not going to listen to you. And so that, but I did manage to find some great friends from that. So, and that was when I started being really into like goth music, punk music, industrial music. Like I really found an outlet in not only the flamboyant pop stars of the era, like Boy George, who were and Annie Lennox, who were real lifesavers to people who didn't fit into binary gender expressions, or were looking for something beyond that. But also just, I suddenly, because I came from London, I came back with all these records that absolutely nobody had. They didn't know who Japan was, they didn't know who Ultravox was. They didn't know who all these bands, I was Scritti Politti. I was listening to all these bands, and suddenly I was the cool kid because I had the line on all the records, and I had friends who would send me records. So,
wow. And this is like mid to late 80s.
This is right now, we're talking for grade schools, it was like 1980, mid 80s, like 1983, 84.
Wow.
So that was really a plus then. And then I went to an all boys high school called De La Salle Collegiate, which was a total change for me. In terms of just being in a total male environment. Right.
Was it Catholic as well, or?
It was Catholic as well. Yes, it was run by Catholic brothers. So they weren't quite priests, weren't quite nuns, but they drank a lot.
Priests in training.
And there were some amazing teachers. It was very education oriented. I had won a scholarship to go to high school, actually,
Mhm.
National Merit Scholarship. So I really enjoyed learning from a lot of the things. But it was also very difficult because it was an all boys environment.
Yeah.
And that was very cruel. That was where I got the beatings and all that
Mm.
stuff, and did
Mhm.
suicidal thoughts, and didn't want to
Mm.
go to school, would
Yeah.
make up any excuse not to go to school. Um, but
Was that an
which
ongoing
was
thing, or
tough.
was it?
In that weird way of life, it wasn't. When you tell the story, it seems like that's the one thing that was happening, but there were so many other things that were happening. I was
Right.
forming a group of friends from other schools and starting to go out to nightclubs. I
Okay.
went to my first club. I went to my first club when I was 14, because luckily at that time you only had to be 18 to get in the club, so it was
Right.
easier to fake an ID.
Yeah,
14.
and going back to your complexion and your facial hair.
Right.
You're like, yeah, I'm
Exactly.
25. What's up?
Ta-da. I'll buy the beer. So yeah, I just threw myself into club life, and that was like a real lifesaver. So on the one hand, I was having this annoying thing at school, but on the other hand, I was having all these connections and going out at night and having all these adventures that nobody there could ever dream of. So joke was on
Right.
them.
Right. Anything else about Detroit that you want to talk
Yep.
about before we leave Detroit, at least?
Sure, yeah. So, my introduction to clubs in Detroit was at this incredible time. In the mid 80s, it was a super fertile, kind of like globally recognized period where new wave and industrial and disco were merging together with funk and soul and R&B and creating techno and
Yeah.
house. So
Yep.
when I started to go to clubs, I was going out right at the beginning of house and techno. So I was
Okay.
there from the very beginning of the scene. The people who created the music were my friends. It was just this insane time to be going out in Detroit and Chicago at that time. And so after I graduated from high school was right when raves were starting to happen.
Ah.
So my friends and I were the first to throw raves in Detroit.
Yes.
And and
Yes.
the reason we wanted to throw them was just because we were seeing how goofy and big raving was getting, and we wanted to make sure that Detroit, the music from Detroit, was getting heard, not just music from Europe and stuff like that.
Oh, that's
So
so
we
cool.
put myself through college at Wayne State University throwing underground raves in abandoned buildings in Detroit.
Nice. Wayne State is in Detroit, or
Wayne State's downtown Detroit. Yeah, that's
downtown?
the
Okay.
State College of Detroit. Yeah.
So you stuck around, but you didn't just like just to be like,
Right.
oh, I'm close to home. You're like, no, bitches, we're starting
Yeah.
raves.
Yeah, no, I
That
was
is so
moving. I
awesome.
moved the minute I could. I moved downtown. I got an apartment, and we just started going into abandoned buildings, bringing in sound systems, setting up DJs, and partying all night long. Yeah.
So like the beeper numbers would go back to you.
Oh hell yes, yes. We had the hotlines. We had our mascot was a big dolphin. So wherever you saw the sign of the dolphin, you knew that was where the party was going to be.
Did they have
Yeah,
names? Did your parties have names, or was it just the dolphin?
No, so our party collective was called Voom, VOOM, and that was kind of the beginning time when people were starting to call their collective something.
Right.
And we also of course back then we thought we were geniuses, but now it's a little embarrassing. But we thought, we had a whole philosophical counterpart. We were bringing situationism into it, and we're bringing deconstructionism into it, and all these economic theories that have been applied to Detroit, we wanted to subvert and broadcast them back out on the suburbs to show that the suburbs were actually the ones living in cultural poverty. And Detroit was plus it was the middle of Afrocentrism. So we had this fabulous, array of different influences and philosophies coming through. So it was fantastic.
Wow. It's not that you guys didn't have an active hand in it, but it sounds like just like a perfect coming together of a lot of elements.
It was the time. It was one of those where you're living in the crucible of a certain kind of history, and you feel like this is the right time, this is what is happening. However, Despite all the wonderful people coming into town for our parties, us going out of town, it was still very lonely being a gay man in the Midwest in the middle of AIDS, especially a young one. And I graduated from Wayne State with a writing and anthropology degree. And I realized pretty quickly that I was not going to have a career as a writer in Detroit,
right?
Especially before the internet, where like there were two newspapers and an alternative weekly, and if you didn't get on them, you're like you couldn't just blog,
Impossible nut to crack.
Right.
Yeah.
So after college, I was kind of couch surfing. When my best friend said, "We're changing our lives," I bought us 2 train tickets. We're moving to San Francisco tomorrow. In one of those like classic bohemian road movie twists. And so we packed up our backpacks and hopped on a train to San Francisco in 1964.
Before, aside from London, had you traveled much out of the area?
Not as much. I mean, because we had the farmhouse in Canada, my family never took really family trips. I had come out to California when I was 15 to visit my aunt with my family, who lived out here in Livermore. And I fell in love with I fell in love with California itself. When we were in San Francisco, I decided I would ditch my family and take the cable car to the Castro, where all the gays were. But of course, the cable car doesn't go to the Castro.
Nope.
So I was like on this cable car, wondering where.
Don't tell anyone who doesn't live here that the cable car totally goes to the Castro. What are you talking about? Totally. And they serve rice-a-roni on the car.
Surely this will take me to the gays.
I want to talk just quickly before that train trip out here. That first trip to Livermore. What were was that your first time to California?
It was my first time to California. I planned a month ahead of time all my looks, because I was coming out. I was going to make sure that what was kind of happening at the time. This was 1985, 1986, so the California punk scene was getting really big, and I had heard a lot of what was going on. I couldn't wait to get to LA to hear KROQ. I couldn't wait to I was going to see where the Mabuhay Gardens was in San Francisco that I had heard of from friends. But we took a road trip from San Francisco down to LA. And I wasn't expecting to be blown away by the physical beauty of it all. Unfortunately, we went to Disneyland, which I could do without for the rest of my life. It was not my scene, especially at the age of 15. But it was, but everything else was just it just kind of wowed me. I was like, whoa, a big city. Holy crap.
Right. And
a functioning big city.
And air. I remember my first times, I'm from Texas, but my first times, it was like the sun and the air were just different. Everything was just different. And
seeing the ocean after only really, we have a beautiful position for our farmhouses right on Lake Huron. So we have gorgeous beaches and a lake, but going to an ocean from seeing a lake all your life was pretty astounding. Yeah.
That was Marke Bieschke. Join us Thursday for part 2, when Mark will tell us all about what he's been doing since he arrived in San Francisco in 1994. Music for Storied San Francisco is by Otis McDonald. Photography for this episode is by me, Jeff Hunt. I also host and produce the show. Our website is storiedsf.com, where you can browse more than 100 episodes and help support us by buying merch from our store. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. If that's Apple Podcasts or iTunes, please do us a quick favor and rate and review the show. And if you have any feedback or people you think should be on the podcast, our email is storiedsf@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Stay healthy, stay home, and stay safe.